The morning of January 31st, 1906, did not begin with a scream. It began with a silence so absolute it felt heavy. On the small, low-lying island of Tumaco, nestled just off the Pacific coast of Colombia, the world suddenly seemed to hold its breath. Fishermen standing on the docks noticed it first. The rhythmic, comforting heartbeat of the tide, the sound that had shaped their lives for generations, simply vanished. Then the ground did more than shake. It buckled. An estimated 8.8 magnitude earthquake tore through the ocean floor, a tectonic shift so powerful it sent shockwaves across the region and far beyond. But for the people of Tumaco, the shaking was merely the overture. As the dust settled from the initial tremors, a new and deeply alarming phenomenon emerged. The Pacific Ocean began to disappear. It did not just ebb away. It retreated with startling speed, pulling back far from the shoreline. Where there was once deep, turquoise water, there was now only a glistening, muddy expanse of exposed seabed, littered with flopping fish and fragments of debris left gasping in the humid air. The elders knew what this meant. This was the withdrawal before the surge. Somewhere out in the deep, dark blue, the ocean was gathering its force, forming into a rising wall of water already racing back toward the island. There was nowhere to run. The highest point on the island was barely a few feet above sea level. In minutes, Tumaco could have been completely overwhelmed. Yet, in the center of this unfolding catastrophe, a single man stood in the doorway of a small church, clutching what many would see as a simple piece of bread, but which he believed to be the Lord of creation. This is the story of a day when the visible and the invisible seemed to meet. This is the account of what many came to call the miracle of the Great Wave of Tumaco. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that Tuesday morning, one must first understand the soul of Tumaco. In 1906, it was a place defined by two things: the unpredictable sea and an unshakable, deeply rooted faith. The people were a vibrant tapestry of African and Spanish heritage, descendants of those who had worked the land and harvested the ocean for generations. Their lives were shaped by the seasons of the church and the cycles of the moon. Life was hard, but it was lived with a rhythmic joy. Tumaco was a town of wooden houses, palm-thatched roofs, and narrow streets where the scent of roasting coffee mingled with the salty tang of the mangroves. At the heart of this community was the local parish, led by Father Gerardo Larondo and his companion, Father Julian Morno. Father Larondo was not a man of soft words or delicate sensibilities. He was a shepherd who smelled like his sheep, a man of action, grit, and a kind of holiness forged in the practical realities of serving a frontier town. He was an Augustinian Recollect, part of an order known for its deep interior life and strong missionary spirit. To Larondo, the Eucharist was not a symbol kept behind gilded bars. It was a living presence. He believed that if God was truly present in the host, then God was present in the struggles of his people. The relationship between the priest and his flock was one of shared endurance. When the rains failed, they prayed together. When the sea was generous, they gave thanks together. This bond created a spiritual foundation that would soon be tested by a seismic event so powerful it would be recorded across the Pacific Basin, with tremors felt far beyond Colombia. In the days leading up to the disaster, there were no obvious signs, at least none that a modern scientist would identify as unusual. The sun rose over the Andes, the markets bustled with the morning's catch, and Father Larondo prepared for the day's duties. Yet, in hindsight, many would later describe that time as the calm before an unimaginable storm. The people of Tumaco were no strangers to the temper of the Pacific, but they lived with a quiet confidence, shaped by their geography and their faith. They did not know that beneath the waves, two tectonic plates were nearing a breaking point, preparing to release decades of built-up tension in a single devastating shift. As we look back at the historical records of the time, the description of Tumaco paints a picture of a town on the edge of the world. It was isolated, beautiful, and fragile. The people relied on the sea for everything: food, transport, and trade. The sea was their lifeblood, but on January 31st, it would become their greatest threat. The earthquake struck at approximately 10:36 am. It was not a quick jolt. It was a sustained, rhythmic grinding that lasted for several minutes, tossing people to their knees and cracking the walls of modest homes. Panic began to ripple through the streets. People spilled out of their houses, crying out for mercy, their voices nearly swallowed by the groaning of the earth. In the church, Father Larondo felt the heavy timber beams above him shudder. He watched as the statues of the saints swayed on their pedestals. But as the shaking stopped, he noticed the most chilling detail of all. The sound of the surf had been replaced by a low, distant roar rising from the horizon. The water was gone. The beach had extended into a desert of salt and silt. The townspeople gathered at the edge of the mud, staring out in trance-like horror at the dark line forming on the horizon, a line that was growing taller and wider with every passing second. They knew that when that line reached the shore, the wooden buildings of Tumaco could be crushed like matchsticks, and countless lives might be lost to the sea. It was in this moment of total human helplessness that the physical and the spiritual seemed about to meet. The people began to run, not away from the shore, for there was nowhere to go, but toward the church. They did not seek a building. They sought a father. And Father Larondo, seeing the terror in their eyes and the towering wall of water rising in the distance, did not tell them to flee. He did not tell them to hide. He turned toward the tabernacle, his hands steady despite the chaos, and prepared for a moment that would be remembered in Tumaco for generations. For many in the town, this marked what felt like the end of everything they had known. Yet it would also become the beginning of what they later described as a miracle. The clock on the wall of the parish house had barely crossed into the 11th hour when the earth continued to tremble beneath their feet. To understand the sheer physical power of this moment, one must look to the geography of the Pacific Ring of Fire. Off the coast of Colombia lies the subduction zone where the Nazca Plate moves beneath the South American Plate. On that Tuesday morning, a massive segment of that fault line, stretching hundreds of kilometers, ruptured. The energy released was immense, comparable, according to later scientific estimates, to an extraordinary concentration of natural force beneath the ocean floor. In Tumaco, the sensation was not merely a vibration. It was as if the island had been seized by a giant and shaken with overwhelming force. The ground did not just move side to side. It rose and fell in sickening waves, turning the solid earth into something resembling liquid. Massive fissures opened in the sandy soil, swallowing sections of the road and sending plumes of water geysering into the air. This process, known as liquefaction, began to destabilize heavier stone structures, while the light wooden homes of the fishermen groaned as their stilts buckled and snapped. Father Larondo and Father Morno were thrust into immediate chaos. The air was filled with thick dust from the lime and mortar of the church walls. The cries of the people outside blended into a chorus of fear. Mothers clutched their children, falling to their knees in the heaving streets, while the elderly looked on with wide eyes, realizing that the very land they had trusted for a lifetime was shifting beneath them. But the earthquake was only the beginning. As the shaking finally began to subside, leaving the town in a stunned silence, a new sound began to grow. It started as a low hum and quickly escalated into a hollow roar. It was the sound of the ocean pulling away from the shore. In a tsunami event of this magnitude, the displacement of the seabed creates a powerful vacuum effect. The water does not simply rise. It is drawn away from the coast with tremendous force. The people of Tumaco watched in stunned disbelief as the port, which was usually teeming with life and deep water, suddenly became eerily exposed. Tumaco is an island of low elevation, a flat expanse of sand and tropical vegetation that offers no high ground, no cliffs to scale, and no sturdy towers to climb. The fastest runners in the village knew they could not outrun the water. The strongest swimmers understood they would struggle against the debris that such a surge could carry. The panic that had filled the streets during the earthquake now gave way to a heavy despair. The people gathered at the edge of the receding tide, weeping and pointing toward the horizon. There, where the sky met the sea, the colors deepened into a dark purple hue. A thin white line appeared, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. At first it seemed like a trick of the light, perhaps a distant cloud formation. But as the seconds passed, it grew taller. It was no longer a line. It was a wall of water rising from the sea, moving toward the shore with alarming speed. Inside the church, Father Larondo stood amidst the debris. He did not pause to assess the damage to the building. His eyes were fixed on the tabernacle. He knew that within minutes this sacred space could be submerged, and his people placed in grave danger. He felt a surge of profound resolve. He did not see himself as helpless before nature. He saw himself as a priest entrusted with the care of his flock. He called out to Father Morno, his voice cutting through the sounds of sobbing that drifted in through the broken doors. He told him to prepare the people. He did not tell them to gather their belongings. He did not tell them to try and find boats. He told them to prepare for a procession. The townspeople, hearing the command, began to move toward the church, their faces marked with ash and tears. They were looking for a miracle because they felt they had exhausted every human possibility of survival. The tension in the air was almost tangible. The temperature seemed to drop as the immense volume of water approached, pushing a cold, wet wind ahead of it. The roar was now so loud that people had to shout to be heard over the sound of the approaching surge. It was a thunderous sound, like heavy trains rushing past, like the earth itself under immense strain. Father Larondo reached into the tabernacle. With a steady hand, he removed the monstrance, the vessel that held the consecrated host. He did not look at the cracks in the ceiling or the heaving floor. He looked at the white circle of bread and, in faith, saw the Lord of creation. He turned toward the door, holding the monstrance high. The people stepped back, clearing a path, their eyes fixed on the golden vessel. In that moment, the fear that had gripped the town began to shift into something else, a desperate, focused resolve. They were no longer scattered in panic. They were a congregation following their shepherd toward the advancing sea. As Father Larondo stepped out onto the street and began his walk toward the beach, the wall of water was no longer a distant threat. It rose high against the horizon, dark and immense, casting a shadow over the shoreline. The first splashes of the returning tide were already beginning to wet the dry seabed, and the foam of the advancing wave was visible to the naked eye, curling over itself in a powerful display of force. Later accounts estimated it to be nearly 16 feet high at its crest, though to those standing on the shore, it felt far greater. Father Larondo, clutching the monstrance with steady resolve, began to lead the procession across the muddy expanse. Behind him followed hundreds of men, women, and children who had left their homes and their belongings to follow their priest. They walked with focused determination, their eyes fixed not on the wave, but on the figure carrying the sacred vessel before them. Father Morno walked at his side, his face marked by intense concentration. The ground beneath their feet was slick with the silt of the ocean floor, scattered with debris from the earthquake. Every few steps, the earth trembled again as secondary shocks rippled through the ground. But the procession did not falter. They were moving toward the center of the unfolding disaster. As they reached the point where the beach met the newly exposed seabed, the wave was close enough that they could see the crests of foam breaking at its top. It was moving with tremendous speed, meaning impact seemed only moments away. The mass of the water pushed air ahead of it, creating a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. This was a moment of extreme vulnerability. There was no wall, no levee, and no natural barrier between the people of Tumaco and the advancing surge. Father Larondo stopped. He stood on the wet sand, the first trickles of the returning tide swirling around his boots. He looked up at the wall of water. In that moment, he stood as a priest facing the overwhelming force of nature. He did not look at the wave with panic. He looked at it with a calm conviction rooted in his faith. He raised the monstrance high into the air. The gold of the vessel caught the dim light of the sun, reflecting against the dark sea. The people behind him fell to their knees, lowering their faces to the sand or lifting their eyes upward in prayer. The sound of the water was so loud it overwhelmed every other noise around them. Then Father Larondo did something that, to those watching, seemed to defy human logic. He began to speak toward the ocean. He did not shout. He did not plead. He spoke with conviction. Over the roar of the approaching wave, he made the sign of the cross with the monstrance, tracing the sacred shape toward the towering water. His words were lost to the wind, but his intent was visible in every line of his body. In faith, he invoked the name of the one who had walked on the waves of Galilee, the one who had told the storm to be still. The wave was now so close that the spray drenched his vestments. The shadow of the water fell over the crowd, dimming the light around them. The crest began to curl, white foam gathering as it prepared to crash forward with immense force. It was a moment that felt like the point of no return. And then, according to those present, something happened that they would never forget. Witnesses later described it as if the water had struck an unseen barrier. The crest of the wave, which had been leaning forward with tremendous momentum, seemed to shudder. The forward motion did not simply slow. It appeared to halt. The water churned in place, surging and folding back upon itself, unable to move beyond the point where the priest stood. The people on the ground felt the spray and the wind, but they did not feel the impact. They looked up and saw a towering wall of water standing only yards away, rising above their heads. To those present, it appeared as though it was being held back by a force they could not explain. The ocean seemed to struggle against itself. The water churned and swirled in place, foam circling violently, yet the line in the sand remained uncrossed. Father Larondo remained motionless, his arms extended, the monstrance held steady before him. He did not step back. For the people behind him, he became a point of stillness in the chaos, a bridge between their fear and their faith. For several seconds, which felt like hours to those watching, the advancing wave and the raised monstrance stood in a tense and unforgettable moment. The silence that followed was as startling as the roar. The water, instead of crashing forward, began to lose its height. It did not surge inland. It seemed to fold back upon itself. The great wall slowly receded, flowing back toward the sea. The thunderous sound softened into the hiss of water sliding over sand. The people remained on their knees, struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. The dark horizon began to clear, and the ocean gradually returned to its natural level. Father Larondo finally lowered his arms. His vestments were soaked, his face pale, but his expression steady. He turned back toward the town, and for the first time since the earthquake struck, the people of Tumaco drew a full breath. The transition from the brink of disaster to the safety of the shore was not gradual. It was a sudden, disorienting return to a reality few had expected to experience. As the towering wall of water lost its momentum and folded back into itself, the people of Tumaco remained frozen in collective shock. They were standing on ground that had seemed destined to be submerged, yet they were still alive and breathing. The unseen force that had appeared to hold the wave back remained beyond their understanding. The ocean retreated, carrying debris back toward the deep, leaving behind a shoreline that was wet, scarred, but still there. Father Larondo did not immediately lower the monstrance. He stood watching the receding foam as it moved across the mud. Only when the water had withdrawn to a distance that suggested the immediate danger had passed did he allow his arms to fall. The golden vessel, which he had held steady through the climax of the storm, now felt heavy in his hands. He turned to face his people, and the sight before him was unforgettable. Hundreds of people lay across the sand, some weeping, others laughing in disbelief, and many simply staring in stunned silence. Father Morno was the first to reach his side. He supported Larondo, whose legs were beginning to tremble from exhaustion. Together, they looked back at the town. While the earthquake had caused significant damage to many wooden structures, Tumaco had not been swept away. Homes still stood. The market remained. The lives of those gathered on the shore had been spared. News of what had happened spread quickly through the crowd. Those who had only seen the shadow of the wave and the raised monstrance moved forward, some kneeling, some touching the ground where the priest had stood. But Larondo redirected their attention. He pointed toward the host, his voice weary but steady. He told them it was not his strength that had preserved them. In faith, he reminded them that the sea answered to its creator, and that what they had witnessed was an act of divine mercy. As the afternoon sun began to dry the wet sand, the broader impact of the event became clearer through the reports that gradually arrived. News came from surrounding regions and nearby islands. The earthquake had triggered a tsunami that did not affect Tumaco alone. It moved along the coasts of Colombia and Ecuador, causing severe damage in multiple areas. Other coastal settlements, some only a short distance away, experienced significant flooding and loss. In several locations, homes were destroyed and lives were lost as the surge moved inland. The contrast, as described by survivors, felt striking. In Tumaco, witnesses said the water had advanced to the very place where the priest stood and then appeared to halt. In neighboring areas, the surge traveled far inland, damaging everything in its path. While some later observers searched for geographical explanations, no clear natural feature was identified at the time that fully accounted for the different outcomes. For the people of Tumaco, the defining difference was the procession on the shore. The townspeople slowly returned toward the center of the village, carrying with them a changed spirit. The panic of the morning had given way to a deep and solemn gratitude. They began clearing debris and checking on the injured, yet their conversations circled back to the same moment. They spoke of how the wave had seemed to rise and then hold. They spoke of the light reflecting from the monstrance. They spoke of the courage of Father Larondo, who had remained standing when instinct might have urged retreat. By evening, a simple altar had been arranged in the town square, as the church was still being examined for structural safety after the quake. The population gathered under the tropical sky. The air remained heavy with humidity, but the sound of the ocean had returned to its steady rhythm. They held a service of thanksgiving that continued into the night. For many, it marked not only survival, but the beginning of a renewed sense of faith and community. Father Larondo remained humble in the aftermath. He wrote letters to his superiors in the Augustinian Recollect order, describing the events with careful detail. He appeared more concerned with the spiritual care of his parishioners than with any reputation that might follow. Yet the story did not remain confined to Tumaco. Accounts of what had taken place in 1906 spread beyond Colombia, eventually reaching church authorities and appearing in newspapers of the time. For many believers, it became one of the most significant Eucharistic events of the modern era, an experience of faith that, in their view, had no clear natural explanation. What could be observed was this: the town had endured. In a region where the 1906 earthquake is still recognized as one of the most powerful seismic events ever recorded along that coastline, Tumaco remained standing. In later years, the place where witnesses said the water halted became a site of local devotion, and markers were placed to remember the day the sea appeared to turn back. Time often softens the sharp edges of history, turning terror into story. Yet for the people of Tumaco, January 31st, 1906 did not fade into legend. The event became part of their identity. Even generations later, the story is shared within families as lived memory. They speak of Father Larondo not as a distant historical figure, but as the priest who stood before the wave when their ancestors believed all hope was gone. The scientific community has continued to study the 1906 earthquake with great interest. Seismologists classify it as a megathrust event, one of the most powerful types of earthquakes known to occur. The tsunami it generated was recorded across the Pacific, with effects reported as far as Hawaii and Japan. Along parts of the South American coast, significant loss of life and extensive flooding were documented. Many coastal communities experienced severe destruction. In contrast, according to local testimony, Tumaco did not suffer the same level of inundation as surrounding areas. When researchers examine the topography of the island, the questions remain. Tumaco sits on a low-lying coastal shelf. Based on common models of oceanography and fluid dynamics, a wave of that estimated height could have inundated much of the island. There was no clearly identified natural barrier, no dramatic rise in the seabed, and no prominent reef known at the time that would fully account for a complete diversion of energy. For some observers, the survival of the town is difficult to explain purely through geography. For believers, the explanation lies not only in the landscape, but in their faith. Father Gerardo Larondo lived out the rest of his years with the same quiet devotion that had led him to the beach that morning. He did not seek fame. He remained a pastor to his community until his death, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape local memory. His companion, Father Morno, also gave testimony about the events, offering a consistent account of the moment the water appeared to stop. Their reports reached church authorities, and over time the event came to be regarded by many within the Catholic tradition as one of the notable Eucharistic miracles of the modern era. Today, Tumaco has grown and changed, yet the memory of 1906 remains part of its identity. Each year on the anniversary of the event, many residents gather in remembrance. They reenact the procession of Father Larondo, carrying the monstrance toward the shore. They walk the same route and look toward the same horizon that once seemed to threaten everything they loved. For the community, it is a day marked by gratitude, remembrance, and faith. This story serves as a powerful reminder for a modern world that often feels overwhelmed by forces beyond its control. We live in an era of different kinds of storms, social, personal, and global. The miracle of Tumaco suggests that there is a power that transcends the physical laws of our universe. It suggests that faith is not a passive retreat from reality, but a courageous confrontation with it. It shows us a man who did not run from the wave, but who stood his ground because he believed that the creator of the universe was quite literally in the palm of his hand. For the viewer watching this today, the message of Tumaco is one of radical hope. It tells us that no matter how high the wall of water may seem, and no matter how empty the horizon may look, we are never truly alone. It invites us to consider the possibility that the divine is not distant and detached, but present in the very elements of our lives. We often think of miracles as events that belong to a distant, dusty past, reserved for ancient scrolls or stained glass windows. But the miracle at Tumaco happened in the modern era, documented by witnesses who saw the same sun we see and felt the same salt spray we feel. It challenges the cynical notion that the world is merely a collection of cold, random accidents. It forces us to ask if there is a deeper rhythm to existence, a divine pulse that can override the fury of the storm. When Father Larondo stepped onto that beach, He was not just defending a town. He was making a statement about the nature of reality itself. He was demonstrating that matter must ultimately answer to its maker. In our own lives, we all face moments where the tide recedes, and we see a wall of impossible circumstances charging toward us. It might be a crisis of health, a collapse of a relationship, or the crushing weight of grief. In those moments, the temptation is to turn and run, to let the waves of despair wash over us. But the legacy of January 31st, 1906, whispers a different path. It tells us that there is a strength available to us that does not depend on our own muscles or our own cleverness. It is a strength that comes from holding on to the eternal amidst the ephemeral. The miracle did not end when the water went back to the sea. It continued in the transformed lives of the survivors. It continued in every prayer of thanksgiving offered in that small parish for the next century. It continues even now, as you hear this story and feel that stir of recognition in your own heart. That recognition is the realization that the same God who commanded the Pacific Ocean is the same God who walks beside you in your quietest, darkest hours. As the sun sets over the Pacific today, the waves still lap against the shores of Tumaco. They are gentle now, a rhythmic reminder of the power that was once restrained by a sign of the cross. The island stands as a living monument to a single moment of absolute faith. It is a place where the ocean met the infinite, and the infinite won. The miracle of 1906 is more than just a historical footnote. It is a testament to the fact that even when the earth breaks and the sea rises, there is a peace that can command the storm to be still. May we carry the courage of Father Larondo with us. May we have the eyes to see the divine presence in the ordinary bread of our lives. And may we always remember that no wave is too high, no sea is too deep, and no storm is too loud for the voice that once said, and still says to us today, "Peace, be still." The miracle of Tumaco is not just something that happened. It is a promise that remains.